This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the topic is narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy. I have three experts who will define those terms, what they are, and how they affect people, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The topic is narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy. I have three experts on those topics. And before I begin and give them a few minutes to introduce themselves, let me just lay out my own personal thesis. The reason I'm doing the show is over the course of my lifetime, I've known people that I think fall into all three categories. And my general thesis is that narcissists are probably the least noxious of the trio, forming sort of the base of a pyramid, going up to psychopathy being the most noxious form. Let me start with Wendy Bahari. She wrote a book called Disarming the Narcissist, and she also has a website of the same name, and I'll link to all the person's websites below. So Wendy, if you could take a few minutes, just give a little background about yourself, why you wrote the book, and any sort of ideas that you have about narcissism in general, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. I'm happy to be with all of you. Good morning. I wrote the book, Disarming the Narcissist, the first edition, back in 2008. And back then, as I often say, there were probably just a few resources in the general audience arena, general reader area on the topic, despite some of the classics in our own industry. When I wrote the second edition a couple of years ago, there were probably 300 resources on this topic. So, I was inspired to write the book originally because I was working not only with some fairly significant level narcissistic males, but I was working with partners as well of narcissists and those that were trying to find ways to survive the relationship and work within the relationship more effectively to try to produce motivation for treatment within their partners, as well as just ways to be able to communicate more effectively, perhaps make an impact on having the narcissist appreciate their behaviors. So that was my original inspiration for writing the book. Since then, of course, the term has become so popular with, political leaders and sports figures, celebrities, etc., over the years that it's on the kitchen table of many people. I am the director of the Cognitive Therapy Center at the Chemotherapy Institute of New Jersey, and as you already mentioned, I do have a website by the same name of my book, Disarming Narcissism.
The next person I want to introduce is Paula Carrasquillo, and her website is lovelifeom.com, and she talks about sociopaths on her website. And I know there's some controversy whether a sociopath and psychopaths are the same, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But Paula, if you could give a little background about yourself and anything you've written in your website.
Sure. Yes. Thank you for getting my name, pronouncing my name correctly. A lot of people get that wrong. Carrasquillo, thank you. So the reason why I wrote, originally I wrote a book, Escaping the Boy, My Life with a Sociopath, because I was in a relationship that I didn't really understand what had happened to me. I didn't really understand that I was being abused. And coming out of that relationship, this person who had abused me actually accused me of having all these personality disorders. So I went out and I started researching personality disorders to try to figure out what the heck was wrong with me, And I started writing about it. I started purging myself of what, in hindsight, I realize now was the trauma that I had experienced. And as I was writing, I was creating a website, throwing my story out there. And the website, it wasn't a blog, it was actually a website, and it was intended for the actual perpetrator of my abuse to understand what I was beginning to understand about him. But then other people started finding my website and contacting me and saying, oh my gosh, this happened to me. I honestly thought that I was the only one. I just thought I was going crazy by myself. Okay. And then people started contacting me, and then I started putting two and two together. I'm just like, oh my gosh. And then people also recommended that I read Dr. Stout's The Sociopath Next Door. But I held off reading that because I didn't want it to influence the story that I was writing. So I finished writing my story, my book, and then I read her book. And I was just like, oh my gosh, okay. So I wasn't completely, I'm not the one that was crazy, okay, because I thought I was crazy. So that's kind of where everything started, with my kind of short novel, about 80 pages long, about my experience with what I term, he's never been diagnosed as a sociopath. So I just wanted to make that very clear. From my understanding and research on all of three of these topics, sociopathy, psychopathy, and narcissism, I came to the conclusion that the person that I was with is indeed a sociopath. So then from there, I created a blog, lovelifehome.com, and I started continuing my healing journey. And now I am outside of my 9-to-5 job, working as a federal contractor. I am a mindfulness coach. So I'm a certified yoga teacher, a meditation guide, a certified integrative nutrition health coach. And that is pretty much me in a nutshell and why I'm here, because my purpose is, I'm not really interested in helping the sociopath. I'm more interested in helping those impacted recover from the abuse. Okay. So that's who I am.
Well, thank you. And you mentioned The Sociopath Next Door, and I'm going to turn to Dustin Wygant in a moment. And I know that was a fairly popular book a decade or so ago, and I think it reinforced the idea in the public consciousness that there is a difference between sociopaths and psychopaths, i.e. that a sociopath can be a bad boss, it can be an abusive, a cold mother, it can be, a drunken lout of a boyfriend, whereas a psychopath, we think of Jack the Ripper or John Gotti or Al Capone or some terrorist. So Dustin, let me turn to you as my final guest. And Dustin is a professor at Eastern Kentucky University and has written on psychopathy. If you could give a little background about yourself, and then I guess kick off, how you would define psychopathy and sociopathy. But first, a little bit about yourself, Dustin.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dan, for inviting me. And it's nice to meet Wendy and Paula. I've read up about you guys, and it looks like you guys are doing some awesome things. Sorry. So my name is Dustin Wygant. I'm a professor of psychology at Eastern Kentucky University, and I also direct our doctoral training program in clinical psychology at EKU. And outside of that, I work as a licensed psychologist in Kentucky and in Ohio. And mainly what I do is perform court-ordered forensic psychological evaluations. So I've been interested in the topic of psychopathy at local prisons, both male and female prisons throughout Kentucky, as well as really interviewing and evaluating individuals in the court system who, through my evaluations, I revealed that they have strong psychopathic traits. So that's really, my work in this area has been limited to both, really been focused both at an academic level, studying some of the basic traits that underlie psychopathy, as well as doing clinical work in court-ordered evaluations.
Okay. Well, let me just start off with you then. Are you one of those people who think that there's a difference between psychopaths and sociopaths, i.e. the sociopath may be the boss who just gets off on torturing his employees, whereas the psychopath is the person who's going to set a bomb like the Oklahoma City bomb or something?
Sure. To be honest, I've used the terms interchangeably. It seems that most of the academic research in this area has focused more on the term psychopathy. So if you look in academic journals and people doing research like this, more neurological and fMRI research with psychopathy, or more of the diagnostic issues and the assessment issues that I work on, it seems that most of the current academics really prefer the term psychopathy. I know there's been some discussion over the years, and I'm sure Paul and Wendy can chime in about this, about kind of the dynamic that you've talked about, Dan, that, psychopath seems to imply a more sinister form of sociopath. I think others have really looked at the issue of what's the underlying ideology of the...
Okay, Dustin, you keep fading in and out again.
We're talking about a more social issues that define the psychopath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just so you know, you're fading in and out again. Let me just. I think I had, before we started, I had said I sort of view these three traits as sort of like the old food pyramid, meaning that narcissists are probably the most abundant, but they're probably the least noxious of the three. Then sociopaths are somewhere in the middle. They'll have narcissistic traits, but they go beyond just being a narcissist into doing active harm towards most people. And then again, the psychopath being anywhere from the Jack the Ripper to the Osama bin Laden type, way over the top. Let me start with Wendy. Do you think that I guess I would call it that narcissism is sort of like the gateway to worse things, sort of like people used to think of marijuana as a gateway drug, that narcissism is sort of where someone can develop into a sociopath or worse later?
I think of narcissism more as a personality, a type of personality that happens along a spectrum. So you can have everything from the more benign narcissistic types who might be more the show-offs, the charmers, the heroic, annoying, obnoxious, self-absorbed type. But then if you move along the spectrum, you may get into more of the malignant behaviors of narcissism, where it's more controlling, devaluing, demeaning, demanding, highly entitled, self-absorbed also, because self-absorbed sort of runs through it. And I guess if you get to the more severe end of the spectrum, where you're tipping into sociopathy, I think you'll see the more abusive, aggressive type narcissists. I always differentiated in my teaching with clinicians around the world who are trying to understand this syndrome and how to work with it. My own experience of treating narcissists has been that most they'll hurt you. I mean, there's no doubt that they will cause harm. They can be incredibly hurtful. They're not all abusive, but they can be. But the motivating driver in narcissism, unlike sociopathy, is not so much about the desire to create pain. It's the desire to protect themselves at any cost. So they'll do whatever it takes to protect face, ego, their sense of power, balance. And if that means crushing you, then that's what they will do to protect themselves. But the motivating driver is really built into what we think of as the origins of narcissism. And in my model, we look at the schemas, the early maladaptive schemas of the narcissist. So they construct these compensatory ways of coping in the world to cover up this insecurity and this sense of shame and defectiveness. And when they're, under certain conditions where they're made to feel threatened or manipulated or out of control or not right, that's when, they may do things that are incredibly painful and hurtful to their loved ones, even though, again, not to make excuses for them, it's just to really try to understand the differential makeup of these folks. It's not so much because they do it for sport, to hurt you. It's really to protect themselves because they are so insecure underneath.
Paula, let me ask you, I gave my sort of food pyramid-like analogy. Do you think that most people who are sociopaths are also narcissists, or can sociopathy arise from, say, a total lack of ego or other things other than narcissism?
Well, just kind of going off of what Wendy was saying, I honestly think it's impossible to have traits of sociopathy and not also have traits of narcissism. They kind of go hand in hand. So, and as far as ego, it's really about an overinflation of the ego and not really any type of self-awareness that goes along with, being able to balance ego with caring for people. But I also wanted to say that, it's very, very difficult to determine if a narcissist, someone who is showing narcissistic tendencies, is also either a sociopath, psychopath, because the thing is that sociopaths and psychopaths, and I also like using those terms interchangeably too, because unless you were with these people when they were born, it's really difficult to determine, were they born, were they made, whatever. But unless they're displaying behaviors of being a psychopath or a sociopath, it's really difficult for anybody who's interacting with a narcissist, someone who clearly is narcissistic, to know if they are also capable of these behaviors of sociopathy and psychopathy. Because most of those behaviors are very covert until they need to use them in a more overt manner to gain control. Because one of my theories is that these people, and I say that these people are the most codependent people on the planet. They need other people to feel valued, okay? Because without other people, they have no meaning in life. So that's why they're so dangerous. I don't care if they're narcissists, they're causing pain, okay? Even if it's just emotional pain, there's deep-seated pain that they're causing. And then the psychopaths and sociopaths, not all sociopaths are physically violent. Emotional violence is just as violent as physical violence. And that's one of the things I want people to understand that are listening to this, is that don't just because he's just a narcissist, he or she's a narcissist, that's just who that person is, and we just have to deal with them and say, oh, things will be better. We love you. There's no need for you to fear that we're going to abandon you, that kind of thing. No, they're dangerous in so many ways. So I don't like the idea of thinking that they're just a narcissist. There's nothing, but I do agree that there is a spectrum, and narcissism is kind of at the lower end of the spectrum of codependency spectrum as well. Like psychopaths, sociopaths are very, very needy, but narcissists are as well, and they create other codependent, traumatized people. That's the one thing that I really want to point out. They create people who are in pain and who are suffering, and they're not really interested in helping those people recover from that pain and suffering that they inflict. So that's a big difference between someone who might be acting narcissistic on occasion, acting selfish on occasion. Those people who I would say aren't necessarily suffering from the personality disorder of narcissism are going to look and say, oh my gosh, I am so ashamed of myself for causing that person that kind of pain. That person, in my opinion, is not a narcissist. They may have behaved in a narcissistic manner, but they're definitely not a narcissist. So that's one of the things I want to point out is that narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths really don't care that they're narcissistic, sociopathic, or psychopathic.
Okay. Well, let me talk about where this may arise from, because 100 years ago, everything was thought to be, this Freudian idea that it was totally nurture. In recent decades, with genetic testing and all this kind of thing, it's thought to be a lot of human behavior is thought to be based upon nature. My own opinion is that there's a mix of nature and nurture. So let me talk about where these things may arise from. We know things like Alzheimer's disease or schizophrenia are basically bad brains, that there's chemical imbalances or whatnot. Do these traits, narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy, do they come from a brain that is somehow chemically off or malformed in some way? Or do they come from, the stern, restrictive mother, or the abusive father, or the father who's left the home? Because, for example, I remember in the famous book that Anne Rule wrote about Ted Bundy, she claimed that he was abused and whatnot. And a lot of the things that she wrote in that book in the late 70s turned out to not be true, later researchers found. So there's a mix of that. Let me start with you, Dustin, since you've done some actual research. Is the brain of a psychopath or a sociopath somehow different than your humble accountant who just goes around for 40 years working his small little job?
Yeah, I do.
I am speaking with Dustin Wygant, Wendy Bahari, and Paula Carrasquillo. We had a little issues with some of Dustin's audio there. Hopefully it's been fixed. But Dustin, I was asking you about the difference between the brain makeup of someone who's a psychopath or sociopath, narcissist, versus, say, your humble guy who just punches the clock for 40 years and collects his pension. So is there a difference?
Yeah, so and I agree with what Wendy and Paula have said. I think the field of psychology is certainly moving in this dimensional kind of framework for understanding psychopathology, including personality pathology like psychopathy and sociopathy and narcissism. In addition to kind of moving in that dimensional framework, there's been a lot of research over the last 10 to 15 years that has been really driven at understanding the underlying neurological mechanisms that seem to be associated with these types of conditions. And there's a particular guy named Kent Keel, who was a student of Bob Hare, and I'm sure that the guests are familiar with Bob Hare. He's one of the preeminent psychopathy researchers in the world. But Kent Keel and his team out of University of New Mexico and something called the Mind Research Institute, they've got a lot of federal grant funding to look at this from a basic kind of underlying. They're basically studying the underlying brain mechanisms that seem to be associated with these types of conditions. And what they have found by actually developing an fMRI machine and parking it inside a maximum security prison in New Mexico, what they have found by scanning the brains of psychopathic offenders are a number of areas of the brain that seem to be definitely associated with these conditions. And one that I think touches on all three of these conditions is the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that really does two things. It does many things, but two of the things that are related to this topic. Number one, it kind of regulates our appraisal of fear conditions. And what we know is that psychopaths particularly seem to show a lack of fear, a lack of anticipatory anxiety. And that, some have actually suggested that that's one of the driving factors of psychopathy, is that there's this kind of lack of fear that those types of individuals have. But the amygdala also helps us in terms of our emotional intelligence and in terms of our ability to appreciate and understand the emotions of other people. And so when you see all three of these conditions that Wendy and Paul and I are talking about, you definitely capture one of the prime aspects of all three of these conditions is a lack of empathy. And the amygdala seems to be the part of the brain that helps us recognize emotions in other people. And so at a basic neurological level, if you have an inability to appreciate another person's emotional experience, it comes across interpersonally as this lack of remorse, lack of empathy, a strong egocentricity, which we see in narcissism and sociopathy and psychopathy. So I think that is one of the things that seems to be driving at least the psychopathic personality. One of the things that when Wendy was talking about kind of her thoughts on narcissism, and I agree with them, what seems to separate narcissism, I think, from some of these other conditions is not only do you have that lack of empathy, but with psychopathy, you also get kind of a more of an abundance of impulsive behavior, more of a general disinhibition. And so the other part of the brain that's widely been implicated in psychopathy is the orbital frontal cortex, the front part of our brain, which really regulates judgment and decision making. And I've seen this in my own research with offenders in various prisons, where when you give them impulse control tasks, the individuals who are more psychopathic definitely have problems doing those sorts of tasks. We also use these emotion recognition measures on computers, and the more psychopathic the individual is, the more narcissistic they are, the more difficult time they have. If you show them a picture of a face for 3 seconds and you say, was that person angry, fearful, sad, or happy, they predominantly get those wrong and tend to view whatever the face is, they see anger. So there's like kind of a hostility, attribution bias that you get with psychopathy.
Well, that's interesting. Let me turn to Wendy. Before I ask you about let me ask you about the nature-nurture argument. But also, do you agree that narcissists would, as Dawson suggests, tend to be more controlling, whereas a psychopath is so far gone that they don't give a shit, basically?
Yeah, I agree with everything Dustin just said, and I'm somewhat familiar with those studies as well, and I appreciate you sharing that. That was a really valuable contribution. There's anecdotal discussions too around the issue of morality, and is there perhaps a missing link there in the neural system, the neural architecture, that might suggest that there's a missing piece on conscience and morality. But of course, a lot of these things are still in the works and not easy to prove. So we're still trying to understand the brain. We can make certain assumptions about this, but we have to be careful not to be so declarative. I think I make assumptions about my narcissistic clients as being possibly, temperamentally overly sensitive. So if you think about nature and nurture, you have a very sensitive child, even more sensitive than your average child, meaning that their need for emotional reassurance and contact and affection and embrace is even higher than that of the average child. And they're met with an environment where the family, just for numbers of different reasons, cannot provide that need. And in fact, the emphasis is more on their productivity, their achievement, their performance, which is typically the case in the origins of narcissism. So much of their worth and their value is based in their performance, and not a lot on understanding the interior world of another. So I don't think it's that they can't be empathic. I think they don't know how to be empathic. They haven't developed the capacity. But I've watched in my own experience narcissists who will sit the course of treatment and are motivated, and there's enough leverage, because leverage is really important, that they can develop that capacity. But it has to start first with a more affect-engaged, emotion-engaged kind of treatment in order to make that happen. And, when that happens and they become acquainted with these kind of unconscious processes that are lurking in their early experience, they can make some fundamental changes. It's not easy. It doesn't happen often, and it really does require a very, specific approach in order to make that happen. But I do think it is a combination of nature, what we bring genetically into the world, and what environment we meet when we get there. Is it capable of being able to meet very specific idiosyncratic needs of the child? And what happens along the way? Bullies and teachers and influencing peer groups that may also have an effect on these constructed modes that happen in order for them to protect themselves.
Okay, Paula, where do you stand on sort of the nature-nurture issue?
So I definitely think that it's a combination. I think that in some cultures, they say that in the American culture, like one in 4 people suffer from sociopathy, and then you have other cultures, say like Asian cultures, where that ratio is much greater. And I think it's because most cultures have kind of set in, norms and mores about walking through society. Whereas in the United States, narcissism is kind of, it's praised. Like, we want people to be confident. We want people to be egotistical. But really, at the same time, we forget the other part of it. We teach our children. So, for example, yesterday, I went into a middle school and lectured well, I don't like to say lectured. I spoke in front of 3 groups of 6th graders. So all in all, I spoke to 70 6th graders. And those are about 10, 11, 12-year-olds. And it's funny what Wendy said is that most of these kids are motivated due to outside influences, due to their parents and their teachers saying, you need to do X, Y, and Z. You need to be this kind of student. Otherwise, you're not going to succeed in, the career that you want. And so I was baffled because, the first thing that I noticed is that I asked the question, are you getting proper sleep? Everybody raised their hand and said, no, I didn't have a good night's sleep last night. And then as the talk moved on, I said, who in here feels confident to communicate with their parents when they're feeling like they have to say no? No one raised their hand. They're scared. They're afraid. And I think at the same time, it speaks to what Wendy was saying. These kids are being programmed, nurtured to be the top of their class, to always get A's, to think that they're smart and intelligent, when in fact, it's not what they want. It's what somebody else wants them to be. So and this comes back again to the self-awareness part. They're not self-aware because they're not allowed to nurture that for themselves. Other people are telling them how to behave, how to act. Okay? So what Dustin was saying about the prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that helps us to basically make decisions about life. That, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that doesn't even completely come into full development until we're 25 or 28 years old. Mm-hmm. And so here we are as children, being told how to behave and how to act, and being too afraid, learning fear around actually communicating with the people who are telling us how to behave and how to act. So what is that producing in adults?
Yeah. Well, Paula, let me just chime in, because I work in a school district. One of the things that I find odd versus when I went decades ago is that, for example, if you walk around some school halls, you'll see little Post-its with these sort of banal little statements like, be happy, smile more, kind of thing. Or teachers will talk about needing to pump up a child's self-esteem or something, and they'll grade on a curve or whatnot. Whereas when I went to school was a place you either learned whatever you needed to pass a thing. It wasn't this sort of psychologizing, and there are so many parties. Someone has a part. Someone will say, it's Sally T's 13th birthday today, and yay. It seems. Do you think that society as a whole has become a more fertile loam for narcissism and sociopathy and these other things? In that,
absolutely, yeah. Yes, absolutely. We're not teaching kids how to think for themselves.
Yeah.
Why
is that?
To having to meet expectations that don't fit with their moral code. They don't even have an opportunity to create their own moral code because somebody's telling them how to behave and what it means to be good. Yeah. And so they're not even able to develop their own moral code, go deep within themselves to figure out what it means to be good, what it means to be compassionate, what it means to be respectful, and it begins with ourselves. So they're taught how to please other people and how to get acceptance from other people, how to be validated outside of themselves. I'm sorry. and how to, so they're always seeking this outside approval.
Mm-hmm.
They're not learning, hey, it starts from inside. And then when you learn self-love, self-confidence, self-respect, then you automatically love, respect, and learn how to communicate with other people on a healthy, non-toxic way. Yeah. But we're not teaching our children how to communicate like that from inside out.
Wendy, do you agree with that? And do you think that schools are the proper place even to teach that, or is that something that churches or parents, it's the responsibility of?
Well, I think we all want and need, we're sort of wired for connection and approval and recognition. I think the problem isn't so much in our striving for achievement and doing well. I think the problem lies in the lack of balance.
What? I'm sorry?
Balance. So when there's a kind of overthrow or an overabundant emphasis on achievement and productivity and success and rising to the top and vying for the Ivy Leagues, and I think the problem lies in just the lack of balance, where there isn't enough emphasis on connection. Too much of the emphasis is on autonomy and performance and approval seeking. So I think schools are, these are a place where we want our children to be educated and also learn how to negotiate more effectively in their interpersonal world with their peers and others. I think teachers can play a role in, basically navigating that effectively, facilitating opportunities for social inclusion and social awareness. But I really do think it comes back to the family to both model as much as possible and to really try to get to know your kids, get to know their makeup, get to know who they are as individuals, and balance the nurturing with the performance orientation.
Yeah. Dustin, how about you? Do you think that schools and this society where everyone has to get themselves pumped up is increasing the ratio, say, of narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths in some form?
Well, I don't know if I'd say that schools are contributing to psychopathy. I think as a culture, yeah, I mean, look, we all have one of these cell phones. We can take selfies all the time. We have social media, which the way we use social media is to remove anyone and their posts that don't agree with us, so we kind of live in a bubble.
Yeah.
My full-time job is as a professor, and we just heard from our state and from our university and our board of regents that we need to think about performance-based outcome in terms of getting funding. So we live in a culture where everything is performance-based. So yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything Paul and Wendy have said. I think it starts with the family. I have 2 young children. You may see them pop in at some point. And we try as parents, my wife and I, to listen to our kids, to let them do what they want to do, but also give them structure. I do think, one of the things that we haven't talked about, and I'd be interested in hearing Wendy and Paula's thoughts on this, but I think at the basic level, not only are there neurological things that are at play with psychopathology, like these personality disorders we're talking about, but I also view them as attachment disorders in some way. And that, I think what you were talking about earlier, you didn't use the word attachment, but what you were talking about was attachment. And the extent to which, once we're born, and of course at that point our genetics, are there, but the whole environmental part starts with early relationships with our caregivers, and whether or not we have secure attachments or some variant of an insecure attachment, which can produce a whole range of personality psychopathology, whether it's narcissism or whether it's more severe as psychopathy or sociopathy.
Well, Dustin, are you talking, when you say, just so people know, attachment, are you talking something like that old film, The Manchurian Candidate, where you have a controlling mother and she raises her son to be dependent upon her?
Well, I mean attachment, I'm using the term very broadly, but there are a number of theories by people like Ainsworth and Bowlby that talk about different forms of attachment in terms of it really comes out of the developmental literature as well as psychodynamic kind of literatures in the fields that have really framed how children and infants develop attachments, whether they are secure in their attachment to kind of separate and view themselves as distinct as they mature. And obviously infants have to be very attached to their caregivers. And as we age, we kind of either develop healthy attachments or what we see in things like, maybe borderline personality, dependent personality disorder, as well as the things that we're talking about today. You see kind of the results of early maladaptive attachments kind of showing up later on in life. And Wendy, I'm sure you deal with this in your practice. It's a lot of what you probably do deals with people who have the outcomes of really maladaptive attachments early on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to end this first segment with a couple of questions, and in the next segment, I want to talk about some kinds of examples of these disorders we're talking about. But I want to ask two final questions. The first one is, I've done several shows on the nature of evil. I do trilogy shows where I'll have a theologian, a scientist, and a philosopher talk about a big topic. And I recently did a show on corporate evil. And I want to talk about whether narcissism or sociopathy is that distinct to individuals, or can groups of people act in these ways? And I'm thinking of things like the Milgram experiment or the Stanford prison experiment. I'll give you just a personal example. Last year, I lost a job because I exposed some criminal activity, and people in the company where I worked told lies about me to get me fired. And I don't think they would have done it on a personal level, but because they were under the influence of, say, the bad barrel rather than the rotten barrel rather than a bad apple, because they were in that rotten barrel, they acted in ways that they may not have been, that on the surface might look like they were psychopathic or sociopathic. So let me start with Wendy and work my way up to Dustin. Do you think that narcissism or these other ills are things that are based in an individual, or can an individual act in a narcissistic or malignant sociopathic way if they are in a group, a company, or some club or something that acts or a terrorist group, say? What are your thoughts on the individual versus the group?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer that. I just wanted to make a comment that's related to that from the things that both Paul and Dustin both just mentioned, because I agree with both of them that there is this kind of cultural era of narcissism, if you will, and this idea that so much of our own value and our worth is really logged into the way we show up in social media, the way we show up in terms of our, as I said earlier, performance. And the mention of the prefrontal area of the brain, I think, Paul, you mentioned about you're referring to the brain pruning, which happens over a long period of time. And I think there's susceptibilities that can be formed even as late as the early 20s for some individuals. So when we think about groups, we think about systems, I do think we can think of at least narcissism. I'll speak in terms of my experience with narcissism, that you can have narcissistic tendencies, right? So if you find yourself in a particular culture where the group is acting in a way that might be more egotistical, ethnocentric, exclusionary, dominant, manipulative in some way, I think if you can tend or trend in that direction, if you will, because of certain traits in your personality from real experience, where they may have been dormant over a period of time, but then you end up in this situation where they become, they sort of emerge and they blossom, or as we say in schema therapy, they become activated under certain conditions. So you may not see this particular sense of entitlement or arrogance or or dominance show up until it's met by an obstacle or a particular condition. So we know that, when schemas and traits go in and out of dormancy based on activating conditions in life. So I don't know if that's answering the question completely, but I do think you have to have a tendency that's already kind of preformed.
Okay.
Or a trauma that occurs later in life that may form that tendency.
Okay. How about you, Paula? Do you think sociopathy is something based in an individual, or can people act in sociopathic ways outside of their normal behavior under the right circumstances?
Yes. So I absolutely believe that life is about dichotomies. We each possess this light side and this shadow side of our personalities, if you will. And if you have a group, say, let's just say an organization where there's somebody who's, I'll use Wendy's word, who has very strong, dominant, narcissistic tendencies or sociopathic tendencies, and that person is in a lead role in that organization, that person is going to have huge influence over these other people in that organization to act in a certain way. That leader, if given enough power, will influence these people. It's almost like brainwashing them into moving from that light side of who they are to that shadow side, because we all naturally have it. Wendy mentioned tendencies, but I think we all have that tendency in us. We're just, that's what we are as human beings, light and shadow. And because we're getting this approval from the leader for behaving in these dark, shadowy ways, we think it's okay. Because that leader is giving us approval. Who cares if that person over there is being outcast from the group? Thank God it's not me. That's what the people in the group are thinking. Thank God I'm not the one that's being kicked out of the group. But at the same time, because the leader is so dark and their shadow side is coming in, their light is being overshadowed. I'm speaking in, metaphorically here, but it really does work. They forget. People in groups tend to forget who they are at their core. And so, which is really sad. So yes, I agree that a group can take on sociopathic characteristics if that leader in the group is him or herself highly sociopathic.
So to use an analogy, someone who may be from an alcoholic family wouldn't become an alcoholic unless he's exposed to a lot of alcohol, I guess. Dustin, let me just ask you to wrap up this segment. I mentioned the Milgram and Stanford prison experiments, and I could also throw in, I forget the name of the teacher who did that blue-eyed, brown-eyed study with children. And then there was another teacher who did something called what was it, the fifth wave or something like that in the 70s. So would it be right to say that it's fairly well established that even non-psychopaths or non-sociopaths can act in that manner given the right circumstances?
Yeah, one thing that we haven't mentioned, we've kind of skirted around this issue, which is I think various mental health fields are moving away, although our current diagnostic nomenclature hasn't done this completely, but I think the field of psychopathy research has certainly found that, rather than referring to it as a categorical construct where you are a psychopath or you're not, I think the underlying research clearly shows that it's a dimensional construct, that you can be more or less psychopathic. And it's really a kind of a constellation of various underlying traits, of which narcissism and lack of empathy and lack of remorse are some of the key features. In terms of the whole group, the discussion that we're having now, I agree with Wendy and Paula that one of the qualities that psychopaths can have is social potency. And so they can be quite manipulative and quite good at getting what they want out of people. And so what happens is, as Paula was saying, if these individuals are in positions of power, they can normalize sorts of responses and behaviors, or at least give the impression that there's a corporate kind of culture in which, you know, it's okay to exploit people. The bottom line is making more money and getting what we can. And so, you know, that can reward. Paula, you mentioned things like, you know, thank God it's not me, it's the other person, right? If you have someone in a position of power who has strong psychopathic traits, they can reward people who engage in behaviors that are driven towards those goals. And so they can normalize those sorts of responses and they can reward them. And so those who are willing to engage in those behaviors are rewarded. Those who aren't are excluded. So, you know, and that's not to say that the people under them become psychopaths, because again, rather than looking at it as you are or you aren't a psychopath, it's able, you know, like those sorts of leaders are able to bring out some of the underlying qualities of psychopaths. So whether or not you, in fact, become one, you know, I think it is kind of nature, nurture, and at some point, if you display enough of these qualities, enough of these traits across situations, you know, I think both of the presenters would say at times, and this was mentioned earlier, at times we can be egocentric. At times we can be self-centered. You know, that's normal human responses. What we're talking about are personality disorders where it becomes the predominant response. It becomes the typical response across situations. I mean, there are certain situations that call for us to be more callous at times or more impulsive. But when those things become kind of regular, I think that's when you're kind of moving into the realm of these three constructs.
Okay, well, let's end this segment here. In the next segment, since we've sort of defined these things, I want to talk about some real-world ways that they manifest themselves, and we'll do that in a moment. I'm speaking with three experts on narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy, and we spent the first 50 or so minutes talking about what these things are, how they manifest themselves, and so forth. I want to get sort of, I guess, a little bit more real world and how these things affect. And so let me start with Wendy, since she wrote her book on narcissism. My wife, in the last few years, has had a falling out with a few former friends of hers, and she'd been looking up these people on YouTube, watching videos, and so she's acquainted me with terms like love bombing and hoovering and things like that, and overt and covert narcissists. And so I wanted to talk about a few categories. And I'll give you an example. Just recently, this past Thanksgiving, my wife and I went to my in-laws for Thanksgiving. And when we were there was this man who I guess worked in finances or something. And he was dominating the conversation, wouldn't let anyone speak. And when my wife and I talked about the arts that we're involved in, he ended up basically standing up at the table, pointing his finger at my wife and calling her a failure because she hasn't been published yet. And my wife ran off crying after giving him the finger and telling him to fuck off. And I then told my in-laws that this guy needed to leave there. Then the guy threatened me, and things didn't get out of hand. But that would seem to be what we would call an overt narcissist. Is that correct, Wendy?
Yeah, that's a fairly overt narcissist, right? Yeah. No holds barred.
Yeah. And a covert narcissist would be someone, for example, my wife sometimes likes to point out how much better she is than other women in my past. And I was looking at some old love letters from a woman that I once knew, and my wife was pointing out, see, this is love bombing. She wants you to think only of her. And then, just as my wife said, once I had given my affections, this person was no longer interested. And my wife said, see, that's a covert narcissist. And there were some other things too. So let me just talk about those two broad categories. The in-your-face, pointing the finger at someone, I'm better than you, I make more money, overt narcissist, versus the needy, I guess you would call, covert narcissist. Can you define, Wendy, if those are correct terms for those things? And are there other kinds of narcissism other than overt and covert?
Yeah, well, there's lots of different examples of that. But the overt narcissist is someone who can be right there, right in your face. They're interruptive. They come across in fairly disrespectful ways. They'll be insulting, they'll be critical, they'll bait and switch you. So in other words, they'll invite you to share your opinion, and then they'll blast your opinion as soon as you share it. So they feel entitled. They feel entitled to break the rules. They feel entitled to make up their own rules, and they do this in very outward, forward type of ways. They can be very, in my treatment room, they can become very, I know they're uncomfortable because it's so clear that they've been triggered when they'll start picking on something in the room, a sound, the way the pictures are laid on the wall, something I'm wearing. It could be anything like that because I know something's getting activated inside of them. The covert narcissist is more of what you think of like the martyrs.
Yeah.
They can be passive aggressive, but that's another category.
Would that be someone like the perpetual victim that in their life nothing's ever their fault?
It's that you think you had a bad day. Let me tell you about a bad day.
Yeah.
You think you have it rough. I'll tell you what it's like to have it. So their pain is always superior. Their suffering is superior. Their victimization is superior. I would never tell people how much money I donate to charities. This is kind of moral self-righteousness that they're still superior and self-absorbed, but it's all kind of as if it's happening behind the scenes, and they're not really complaining, and yet they're always complaining. So, I say this in sort of, somewhat cynical terms, but it's frustrate me even more. I find working with over-narcissists, actually, it's right out there on the table.
Yeah.
It's a little harder with covert because they're a little more removed from the reality of, their own narcissism, basically.
Well, do both overt and covert narcissists need to have the attention? Like I said, my wife had familiarized me with the term hoovering. For example, this one woman that I was mentioning years later had contacted me out of the blue after I was married and whatnot, and my wife said not to answer it, but I was kind of stupid, and I said, well, she's just saying hello and whatnot. So I wrote back a friendly email or whatnot, and I never heard from her again. And she said, see, she wasn't going to respond to you. She just wanted to know that she could get your attention and whatnot. But like that, the overt narcissist at Thanksgiving, this is someone that whenever anyone popped up with an opinion about anything, or if people were having side conversations that didn't involve him, he had to involve himself. So either way, it has to be about them, whether they're just getting your attention momentarily or they're demanding it, right?
Well, if it's happening, it could be happening in fantasy. So it might be that they're more the quiet narcissist who just engages in their own grandiosity and fantasy. Getting your attention is happy enough because she's inserted herself back into your life, and you've given her the response that she's still meaningful and on your mind. And where the overt narcissist inserts themselves very explicitly, feeling their sense of importance and this entitlement to express their opinion even when they're not being invited to express their opinion, because they always feel like they have a contribution to make. This is their way of being important. It's almost always a compensation for some kind of insecurity, and if it's more extreme than that, to go back to what Dustin was saying, it could be that there's a lot of impulsivity in their makeup, so they can't even control that behavior.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to Paula and sociopaths. I know you've written, it seems from what I've looked up, more about personal sociopaths and personal relationships. But for example, I've also known bosses that were sociopaths. I once worked at a company for 364 days of the year. The boss we had was a terrible human being. And then on Christmas Eve, he would pass out company turkeys and give out Bible verses and smile at everyone. Are there different varieties of sociopaths, those that are sociopathic in personal relationships only, those who are sociopathic in business relationships only, and those who are sociopaths all around?
Well, I think a single sociopath can wear many masks depending on who his audience or her audience is. So, for example, in the workplace, I've discovered that people who are managing individuals who have sociopathic tendencies, who are managing people, one of the telltale signs of a person like that is that there's chaos all around them. They enjoy disorder. They enjoy causing people confusion. In personal relationships, it's called cognitive dissonance, where the victim doesn't know whether he or she is coming or going because the perpetrator of the abuse, the sociopath, is praising them one day and then persecuting them the next. And then the next day, the perpetrator is acting the victim. So like there's this triad of roles that the sociopath can use. But in the workplace, it's very confusing because you've got individuals who want to please their manager, this person, but they keep changing the goalposts. So that's a telltale sign. If you have a boss who says, okay, I'd like you to do this to accomplish this goal, and then the next day you're doing what your boss told you to do, but then he comes back and says, why are you doing that? You told me to do it because, no, I want you to do this. So basically, in the workplace, it mirrors interpersonal relationships as well, but it's just at a different level. It's not as emotional at first. It's not playing with your emotions and as it is in the workplace, where it's actually someone's messing with your career. They're messing with your integrity just by using control and manipulation to cause you confusion. So that's a red flag for anybody in the workplace or in a relationship. If you become confused, you're not normally confused by what is expected of you, then you really need to figure out the source of your confusion and either leave the job, find another job, or seek a marriage counselor, relationship counselor. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but
well, let me just ask: do you think that, say, the bad boss that treats all of his employees like dirt, is that boss more likely to go home and be a bad husband who cheats on his wife, or an abusive mother who neglects her kids? Do you think?
Well, I guess if you're assuming that bad boss is a sociopath, more than likely he or she is abusing every relationship that they're in, because their sole purpose is to be in complete and utter control of every relationship. Some people may or may not be aware that they're being controlled by this person, because I know a lot of people who are in marriages who don't even realize that they are actually in a controlling marriage. They think it's normal. It goes back to what Dustin was saying. This behavior is normalized. You're led to believe that this is normal. Other things are not normal. Okay, so more than likely, yes, if this person is suffering from some type of personality disorder like narcissism or psychopathy or sociopathy, yes, every relationship they're in is being controlled and manipulated. They're hurting people, everyone in their life.
Well, let me turn to Dustin about psychopathy. And, when I was younger, I once had to go and testify against someone who I suspected was a serial killer. And I also grew up in a very Goodfellas-like environment. And when I think of the really bad people, the psychopaths, you think of someone who is a terrorist, or someone who's a mafia hitman, or someone who is a serial killer. Are there different sort of varieties of a psychopath that? Because when we think of a serial killer, for example, a Ted Bundy, we're talking about someone who's psychosexually screwed up. Whereas someone like a John Gotti may not be like that, but he might kill just for money. So how do you approach the different varieties of a psychopath?
That's a very interesting question. I think the public greatly misperceives the idea that psychopaths have to be violent. They don't. The vast majority of people who are serial killers probably have either strong psychopathic traits or maybe psychotic. But the vast number of psychopaths are not serial killers and have not killed anyone. So, in fact, kind of the more classic kind of development of this construct of psychopathy goes back to a guy named Herbie Cleckley, a psychiatrist who wrote a book called The Mask of Sanity back in the early 40s. And he didn't describe psychopathy at all in terms of violence. It's later, later people who have investigated it have, discussed the idea that violence is part of the construct of psychopathy. I think what Paul and Wendy would probably both agree with, though, is regardless of violence, antagonism is kind of a component of psychopathy, and that one of the core. In fact, a lot of people investigating psychopathy feel that antagonism, interpersonal antagonism, is probably the core of the construct. When you ask about the typical nature of psychopathy, it's actually it's difficult to answer because I'll be honest, the field of psychology is still struggling with how we define this construct of psychopathy. There's a huge debate going on right now about the underlying traits that are part of the construct of psychopathy. Where the debate seems to be centered on is not whether antagonism or impulse problems are part of it, but this construct of fearless dominance or boldness, kind of the suave, bold interpersonal style, kind of the person who has a high level of self-assurance, seems to be socially potent. That's really where the debate lies in the field of psychology, is whether or not that's part of psychopathy. And if in the camp that disagrees with including that would say that those are actually pretty good qualities. They're positive qualities. They seem to be negatively correlated with other aspects of mental illness, and therefore, if boldness and fearless dominance is part of psychopathy, why is it so strongly related to to positive mental health versus negative qualities? So I think that's part of where the debate is. And so when you ask what is a typical psychopath, it's really difficult to answer that question because I don't think our field is completely settled on a definition of psychopathy.
Well, was that, just to get back to the semantics of the difference between sociopath and psychopath, was because the term sociopath is the most recent term of the three. Narcissism goes back to the Greek myth, and psychopathy goes back about 150 years. I think sociopathy only about 30 or so years. And I thought that sociopathy was a term developed basically to mean a more mild form of psychopathy. Am I wrong in that?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's debate about that. The term psychopathy actually was the original term. Here comes my little friend. I knew this would happen. Honey, Daddy's working on it, okay? Can I get you in a second? These are my little helpers. I'm going to actually have two girls who are going to grow up being able to spot psychopaths before So, the term sociopath it's been around for a while. And actually, when you look at the first diagnostic manual, the DSM-1, that came out in 1952, it was actually called sociopathic personality disturbance. And it wasn't until later on that the term got switched to antisocial personality, and psychopathy's been around for a long time, although it's not part of the official diagnosis. I think some people would say sociopathy is a milder form of psychopathy. Others would say that sociopathy is really the part that has been more motivated by social influences, whereas psychopathy is really a more neurological condition and more driven by psychological factors.
Okay. Let me turn... I want to turn to Wendy and Paula and give two examples in both narcissism and sociopathy and get their opinions on them. The first category, let me go with Wendy. I want to talk about what I think was a narcissist that I knew, and just give you an example and see if you would agree. Because the reason I want to do this in this segment is because anyone listening to this may recognize certain traits. I once worked a job, and I was I was a
I'll be right back.
trainee, and the train. Okay, thanks, Dustin. And I was a trainee, and the trainer, I think, was a narcissist. This person, this was male, was a former bodybuilder, and he was training me to do certain things. And I followed everything and did everything as he was doing it. It turned out that some of the things that he was training me were against the company protocol, and eventually I suffered the wrath of that because it turned out he was involved with the female boss at the time. But more than that was he came after I had gotten into trouble. He came to me and said, I'm sorry that you got in trouble. You're not the one who should have gotten in trouble. And I said to him, well, there was only two of us there, so if I'm not the one who should have gotten in trouble, but he didn't come out and admit that he was the person at fault. He wanted me to sort of give him my sort of, oh, it's okay, kind of thing, without actually admitting it. Is that something that would that be considered a narcissistic trait? Because I suspect it is, Wendy.
Well, it could be. I mean, I'm always careful not to jump to
Yeah.
conclusions on any of this without a thorough,
Sure.
investigation into this personality. But it could be, and here's why it could be: because narcissists are always looking to be off the hook. I mean, they have a really hard time with accountability and responsibility for their errors and their behavior. So, tossing it over to you or trying to redeem you by saying, you really shouldn't have taken the fall for that. Well, isn't that heroic? I mean, so there's a kind of.
But he would never. He wouldn't apologize. He wouldn't say, "I'm sorry." That was
Right.
the thing that stuck in my mind. Is he did everything up to admitting that he was the person at fault without actually apologizing.
Yeah, because the apology, in my book, I talk about the redemption of the sinner versus compassion for the wounded. They're always trying to redeem themselves, restore their faith, restore their sense of okayness and righteousness. And the only I'm sorry you'll get is the I'm sorry that comes with a but, defensiveness, and some kind of explanation, or something very callous and cynical that's just sort of making fun of your sensitivity. So they're not apt to apologize in a Catholic way. That really suggests they understand, what you've suffered as a result of their acts, and they can, sometimes fool you into thinking that their apology is actually remorse, when in fact it's really about coming to the rescue and being your hero. Now, that being said, I mean, they can learn to differentiate the two in time. It takes a lot of work to get there. But I think it's an example of the possibility of a narcissistic trait. Dan.
Well, let me turn to Paula, and I want to give another example that I'm not sure whether it would be considered narcissistic or sociopathic. About 20 years ago, I worked at a Fortune 500 company, and one of the people I worked with on my team was this fellow who was sort of an older version of that old TV sitcom character, Urkel. He was sort of this overgrown black nerd with glasses, and he was very timid and very shy. And he got involved with a woman at our job who was quite physically attractive. She was a single mother. She had dated one or two other guys where we worked, and she was known by both the males and the females as being very erratic, highly erratic. And so she dated, after breaking up with her previous boyfriend, she and the Urkel fellow dated for about 6 months, maybe a year, I'm not sure. And then after they broke up, he was devastated, and she went around basically just talking about what a terrible person he was. He eventually had a bit of a meltdown, left the company. And I'm just wondering, is that the kind of trait that would be considered sociopathic or narcissistic, or both, do you think, Paula?
Well, that would be tough, too, for the same reasons that Wendy mentioned, trying to define someone as a narcissist. Without really knowing the insides of the actual relationship dynamics, it would be very difficult to, I mean, if
But does that sound like an archetype?
I'm sorry?
Does that sound like an archetype of either one? I mean, I can't know what people did in behind closed doors, but I'm just saying archetypally.
I mean, was this Urkel type guy, was he at a vulnerable stage in his life? I mean, was she promising him?
Yeah.
I mean, these are the things that we don't know. Like,
Yeah.
was she promising him something if he became, got in this relationship with him? Like, why did the relationship end? Like, there are so many unknowns, right? With this example, it would be really
Yeah.
super difficult for me to determine or
Okay.
even want to start to judge this.
Well, let
dissect
me just ask you then. Can you give me an archetypal sort of sociopathic relationship that you've studied or written about? You know,
Well, I can give
personally
you
or
a personal
friends.
example.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, so, like I said, for me, from what I've experienced, and also from the stories that have been shared with me, it seems like these sociopaths who are seeking romantic partners are seeking someone who is currently in a state of vulnerability. This person, their target victim, let's just say, their target is vulnerable for some reason. These targets are generally very, very intelligent people, have a lot of resources, either financial, they're highly educated, they have high integrity. These are like the cream of the crop of society who also have a lot of compassion, passion, integrity, intelligence. And here's a sociopath who wants that and sees that, but also at the same time the target is vulnerable. Either she's just coming out of a divorce, a relationship, she's lost her job, she's lost her job, some kind of disorienting dilemma is happening in his or her life, and they're feeling vulnerable, and they're at a weak place in their life. The sociopath swoops in, okay, recognizes this, because they have a very good ability to read situations. They're great observers. They sit back and they assess. And this is from my experience with them. And they say, okay, what is in it for me to get involved with this person? And they see a lot of things. So, I call sociopaths, one of the things that I refer to them as, they are information swipers. They steal other people's intelligence and use it as their own. So if this person that they're getting involved with is, say, like I said, in a position where they're a professor, or they have a management position, and they have money, but like I said, they're still in this vulnerable position, this sociopath swoops in, and I'll use the terms that your wife uses. They love bomb their target. They put them up on this pedestal. These are red flags for anyone. Someone who doesn't know you, how could you possibly know? How could you possibly have this opinion of me? This is what it should be going on in the target's head. How can someone who's just met me possibly have these high opinions of me? They don't even know me. So what happens is they swoop in, they put this person up on the pedestal, and then they start tearing the person apart. And this happens insidiously over time. This doesn't happen like immediately or within, the first few nights of their intimacy. It happens insidiously over time, depending on what the sociopath wants from the target and how valuable he sees this shiny target in front of him. So the relationship could last as long as maybe 3 months. He gets what he wants, he gets what he wants, and then discards the target. Or it could last a lifetime. There are people that are in these relationships, and the sociopath uses them as a status.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting.
It's
interesting you mentioned that, because I mentioned the fellow at Thanksgiving, and the interesting thing was I asked my in-laws, why did they invite this nasty guy over, and they said, well, my mother-in-law is friends with his wife, and his wife has fibromyalgia, and this fellow apparently takes care of her, and so we were thinking that she's so dependent on him physically that she basically has to put up with his excesses in public. So
well, and then that leads me to another theory that I have. I wonder how this woman ended up being diagnosed with fibromyalgia, because fibromyalgia just doesn't happen to a healthy person. I mean, I really do believe that these toxic relationships can lead to many conditions, medical conditions for their targets, anything from depression and anxiety to something like fibromyalgia and even cancer in some cases. But could be a completely different panel.
Yeah.
Discussion.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to Dustin. I had given Wendy and Paula examples from my own personal life of what I thought might be narcissistic or sociopathic relationships or people. I wanted to ask you and give you, though, a famous fictional example. Some years back, I reviewed the film Taxi Driver with Robert De Niro. I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, Dustin. And in most of the reviews of that film, the critics are always calling the character played by De Niro, Travis Bickle, a psychopath. And I argued, no, Travis Bickle is not a psychopath. He was a borderline personality because he's capable of love. He's capable of deep affection. And it's almost an overdose of this for the Jodie Foster character, for the Sybil Shepherd character in the film that he sort of obsesses on. That is his undoing. He's not a psychopath. If you've seen that film, would you agree that a character like Bickle isn't a psychopath, more of a borderline personality? And can psychopaths actually love?
So I first got to acknowledge it's been many years since I've seen Taxi Driver.
Yeah.
So I can't probably comment as much on that character. One thing, though, I've noticed in the discussions that we've had in this last segment is one thing that I would point out and something I've had experience with, I did a study over the course of 3 years at a medium security prison in central Kentucky. And in that time, my students and I interviewed probably 250 to 270 male inmates. And there's a tendency, I think, to point out examples and overly rely on specific instances to classify these overarching constructs of narcissism, psychopathy, and sociopathy. So let me give you an example. A student would say, this guy that we're rating now on these various checklists and clinical rating systems, this guy killed 2 people. He's got to be a psychopath, right? Yeah. And I would say, no, he doesn't have to be a psychopath. In fact, most of the people who were in our sample, we had roughly 40 to 50% were in for homicide-related offenses, and our base rate of psychopathy was probably around 20%. So I think there's a tendency, especially by individuals who are not trained on diagnosing and assessing these constructs, to rely on instances, either examples or episodes, and really overly rely on those in terms of classifying what amounts to a personality disorder. So personality disorder, again, is something that happens across time, across situations. So, and I'm sorry I'm not answering the Travis Bickle question.
No, that's fine. Dustin, you bring up a good point. Dustin, you bring up a good point, though. Are we sort of over-diagnosing things? Because when we're talking about either autism or ADD or rage disorders, and things, that it used to be that some people were just pretty dumb. Some people were nasty. And now everyone is a narcissist, or they have some acronymic disorder of some form. Do you think that we have overdiagnosed things that were?
Yes. Yeah. The short answer is yes. We have a more educated society. We have readily available access to an infinite amount of information. And so I'll just give you 2 examples, WebMD and Wikipedia. You can type in psychopathy, sociopathy, narcissism. You can do a Google search on any of these. And there's the impression that these are extremely easy things to see.
Yeah.
And so it lends itself to like, oh yeah, this guy showed up for, Thanksgiving dinner and he was kind of a jerk to everyone. Yeah. This guy must be a psychopath, or he must be a complete narcissist. I mean, we really don't know kind of what led up, to the guy clearly displaying some antagonistic qualities. And I'm not saying that he doesn't have those qualities, but there are other explanations as well, possible explanations. And so what you'd have to see is, does this guy have a pattern of behavior that in which these kind of qualities emerge, across time, across different relationships, different contexts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, but let me just ask again, though. Do you think that someone who's a classic psychopath, can they love, and is the ability to love or the inability to love, is that definitionally part of psychopathy?
Absolutely, psychopaths can love.
Yeah.
Some of them. We're again talking about these constructs dimensionally, and psychopathy is not a simple construct. It is a construct that is really encompassed by a variety of underlying traits, and each of these traits can be construed along a dimension. So some psychopaths can have more of an ability to love, and where you actually see the psychopathy might be more of the impulse control problems, and you might see empathy problems in other contexts. I'll give you a classic example, and you guys can look this up if you're not familiar. There was a guy named Richard Kuklinski, also known as the Iceman.
Yeah.
He's a real life person. I mean, he's no longer with us, but he was alleged to have been a hitman for the Gambino crime syndicate.
Yeah.
And over the course of 20 years, may have murdered, 100 to 250 people, depending on what source you go on. You can watch prolonged interviews with him, and he'll tear up when talking about his family.
Yeah.
And so, and this is a guy who was married, had kids. There's stories of him, executing people on Christmas Eve, but getting home in time to put the presents out, for the kids. So when they wake up the next morning, they'll have their presents. Some would say, maybe this guy views his family as an extension of himself. And so because he's so egocentric, he views his family as kind of part of him. But you could also see that this guy seems to have what appears to be some level of love or affection for his wife and children.
Yeah. Let me turn back to Wendy and narcissism, since as I've sort of painted it, it's sort of the bottom, I think, of this pyramid. And we talked earlier, I think either you or Paula had brought up the idea about sort of braggadocio or whatnot. But it seems to me that, and I'll give you an example, LeBron James, people who are watching this many years from now, is probably the best basketball player on the planet. His team won the National Basketball Association title last year. And during the course of the playoffs, he said, I'm the best basketball player in the world, and I'm going to, and he several times he said this. Now, some people would say that's narcissistic or that's braggadocio, but if the guy can back it up and he is the best basketball player, is he really a narcissist? Wendy?
I've back towards what Dustin was just talking about and what I said earlier about the example. I'm always loath to jump in and call someone, a narcissist or a psychopath or a sociopath based on just a little bit of information or a certain behavior on the television or even a conversation. I do think that we have to look deeper at patterns and trends that have happened over a course of time. You could say just shorthand, or maybe in a more colloquial form, is it a kind of maybe harmless Muhammad Ali-like narcissistic quality to brag about oneself in an overly, superior, self-confident way? Okay, perhaps. But I think if we're going to talk about a pathology of narcissism or something more clinically based, then we have to do our due diligence to really examine, the multifaceted, complex aspects of these personality types. And, it goes back to this, we rush too quickly to make diagnoses just based on a little bit of information when there's so much that has to we have to be thoughtful about how we form our conceptualizations on these topics.
Let me just ask Paula. Sometimes my wife will talk about people she works with, and she'll say, well, people she's known, and she'll tell me what argument they may have had about something, and she'll talk, and I'll say, well, my opinion is that person is just a little bit fucked up. And she says, oh, is that your professional opinion? And I'll say, well, but you're ascribing things to this person, and you're just telling me, like, like we said, just this thin veneer of what they've done. And I can't really say anything else. This is, this person may be a terrible person. They may be abusive in their personal lives or whatnot. Do you think that we sort of overdiagnose these things, whether it's narcissism and these other disorders?
Yeah, yes. So I get a lot of people contacting me through my website, and the first line is, I'm going to describe something to you, and I need to know if my boyfriend, my husband, is a sociopath. Okay, so I get these like paragraphs of like details about what this person did, and my initial response is generally, I can't really tell you for sure if this person is or isn't a sociopath. But what I can ask you, and what you can know for sure, is how does this person make you feel? What is this person's impact on you? It doesn't matter if they're a sociopath, narcissist, or psychopath. If this person is making you feel less than, if this person is causing you cognitive dissonance, if this person has traumatized you in any way, then it's toxic. So it doesn't really matter if the person is or isn't. The main point is this person healthy for you? So that's usually the bottom line that I give to people. So your wife talking about somebody like that, I would just say, well, how does that person make you feel? Maybe you want to avoid having, conversations with this person. If this person is going to make you feel anxious, and, get your blood boiling, So, I mean, bottom line, we will never know for certain, unless the science, catches up with all of us, and we can, prick their finger and determine for certain with a blood test that someone is one of these personality disorders. But that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
It really is never going to happen.
I would only just slightly disagree with that, because I do think we do have ways of evaluating and determining diagnoses if you're working with them in the treatment room. So I do think that there are measures, there are scales and ways that we can determine people diagnostically. But I think when we're out there in society and everyday life, I like your approach to women or people who are feeling disenfranchised or feeling perhaps monopolized or abused by someone, that's really the primary focus.
Right. And what I meant by pricking their finger, like as somebody who isn't a therapist, if we could just prick someone's finger, we're in a relationship with someone, we get a blood sample, and take it somewhere to a lab, like parents do if they want to know if their children are doing drugs. So that was my point. Yes, I wasn't definitely not downplaying the research that's going on by therapists and scientists at this time. Yes.
All right, well, let's end this there in the final segment. I'll give you each a chance to wrap up your thoughts, and we'll do that in a moment. Closing remarks now from all three people. Let me start with you, Wendy, since you said you have to go. What are your final thoughts about narcissism, and if you want people who may want to contact you through your website?
Well, I appreciate you having me. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you, Paula, Dan, Dustin, to talk about these important topics. I mean, these are some of the most complex, challenging, and complicated personality disorders that we confront as humans in everyday life, as well as in our treatment rooms. And if anyone is interested in talking with me, consulting with me on the topic of narcissism, whether you are a narcissistic person you think you might be, or you're dealing with someone who you think might be narcissistic and you want some help, you can reach me at my website, which is disarmingthenarcissist.com. And thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you, Wendy. The topic has been narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy, and I just finished with Wendy Bahari, who has written about narcissism. So I'm going to end with Dustin and Paula, and let me just start with Dustin first, and then Paula can have the last word. In this recent election cycle, for example, with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton running for president, both sides left and right were slagging each other. Donald Trump was a psychopath who pussy grabbed. Hillary Clinton was a sociopath who was going to get us into a war and whatnot. Do you think that we do a disservice to these real terms when we throw them about so casually about, public figures, and not only, politicians, but about sports stars or rap singers or that kind of thing?
Well, I think, I think all three of these things that we've talked about today not only are complex, I would agree with Wendy, they're extremely complex, but they're also extremely fascinating. And we've known about people who display these characteristics for as long as we've been people. So, I think it's not surprising that, come this election cycle, these sort of labels have been thrown around. I mean, you could have looked at any number of articles in the lead up to our election that would suggest that Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton are both psychopaths, narcissists, or sociopaths. I mean, there's just no shortage of those types of topics and articles. What I would say is we have a colloquial sense about what these things mean. People throw out the word narcissist, psychopath, sociopath all the time. They're in our films, they're in our news, they've kind of made it into the cultural lexicon that we all use. So I think where there's a disservice is when people have a lot of confidence that they can quickly and easily, apply these labels to people that have not been formally assessed. One of the things in the last kind of topic, the last part of the show today, has been on kind of addressing an issue I would call confirmatory bias. When you get people who email you and say, "Hey, I'm thinking I'm in this relationship, and this person's a sociopath." And by the way, I also agree with Wendy that your approach is brilliant. Like, it doesn't really matter what you call them. If they're invalidating you, it's not a healthy relationship, and you should probably not be a part of it. But you would probably also agree that they provide a description that fits the preconceived notion that they're a sociopath. And so they'll point out every example that confirms their impression that they're a sociopath. And they're contacting you on your website because you've written a lot about this topic. And so they're finding sources like yourself. They're pointing out examples that fully support this notion that their partner or the person they know is a sociopath. And they're describing it because it's, people have a sense very quickly that this person fits into this, what I agree with all of you guys, that these are very complex things. And so, yeah, I mean, I think everyone can be a therapist, everyone can be a doctor these days and kind of throw out these terms. And I think it probably does do a disservice because these are really important labels. No one wants to be labeled a psychopath, a narcissist. I mean, they're very pejorative terms. Yeah. And in the work that I do as a forensic psychologist, I'll tell you, if a judge or a jury hears the word psychopath applied to a defendant, research shows that they are much more likely to find this person guilty and much more likely to apply a more harsh sentence. And so these terms have very real-world implications. And usually the implications are it's not good for the person being labeled, a psychopath, a sociopath, a narcissist.
Yeah. Well, Dustin Wigan is a professor at Eastern Kentucky University. I'll link to his webpage as well as the web pages of Wendy and Paula. Paula's is lovelifeom.com. Let me just end with you, Paula. And when we talk about real life implications, I think back many years ago, there was a time when I knew someone who had called another person a sociopath, and I don't think that they were. And what happened was later on, another person used the same term, and I didn't really react to it. And the person the second time, I think, really was a sociopath and did a lot of damage to other people. Do we run into sort of the boy who cried wolf syndrome sometimes by doing that? Because if we're not careful, we can sometimes overlook people who really are damaging if we label people damaging who really aren't as bad as we think.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the kind of phenomena that happen when people start finding blogs like mine and they start researching sociopathy and psychopathy, they start seeing sociopaths everywhere. Everyone's a sociopath, okay? And it's super dangerous, because they get so inside this information and they fail to look outside looking at themselves, they fail to go outside of themselves and look at themselves. So yes, there's definitely a danger if we're not disseminating the information in a careful and idealistic way. So I absolutely believe I want people to understand this information. It's so important, but it takes time. It takes commitment. It takes people like the three of us today getting together and having this conversation, and hopefully people will tune in and actually watch this interview, watch this discussion to realize, hey, there's still a lot I need to learn. Just because I read this site or this book, I can't go around, labeling people, as narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths, because it really does, like Dustin says, it does all the research and all of the dynamics of these disorders a disservice if we're just using the terminology just all willy-nilly and not really using enough of our intellect to discern truly what it is that we're looking at.
Is it okay if I add something real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I did a talk a couple of years ago at my university for the general public about my research with psychopathy, and I invited some of my colleagues who were local judges and attorneys, and I got a lot of crap from my attorney friends, mostly defense attorneys, because they said, after your talk, the local judge, I'm not going to tell you who it is, he in open court would say, I think this guy might be a psychopath. So he heard my talk and was interested in it. And for like the next 2 weeks in open court, he's having discussions with attorneys, maybe a drug court client or someone saying, oh my gosh, I think this guy's a psychopath. And I got a lot of crap from my friends saying, this judge, he thought everyone was a psychopath after listening to you.
Yeah, that's not good. I know I once worked in a children's court sometimes, and it's amazing the way, well, I won't even get into it. But anyway, I want to thank Dustin and Paula, and also Wendy, who's not here any longer, for their thoughts, and thank you for a good show.
Thank you.